Anna's name has been buried in the quieter corners of history, overshadowed by the grand tales of Russian tsars and glittering palaces, yet her story is far more astonishing than most royal scandals or battlefield victories. Born in the late 18th century, she was not destined to be a ruler or a warrior, but her life would become a remarkable testament to endurance. In an age when a woman's worth was often measured by the size of her family, Anna's fate was sealed early. She was married young, as was common, and stepped into the role of wife and future mother with the same quiet acceptance that so many women of her time were expected to show. Russia at this period was a land caught between tradition and change. The old customs of the nobility still dominated family life, and one of those customs was producing as many heirs as possible to secure lineage, wealth, and status. What Anna could not have imagined was that her body would be called upon to bear child after child, with barely enough time to recover before the next pregnancy began. She was not a queen or empress, yet the sheer scale of her motherhood would set her apart from almost every other woman in recorded history. From the very beginning, Anna's marriage was defined by duty. Her husband, whose ambitions rested heavily on the idea of a large, powerful household, believed that children were not just blessings but also signs of prestige. In those days, infant mortality was high, and many families lost children to disease before they reached adulthood, so the drive to have as many as possible was both emotional and practical. For Anna, this meant that her married life quickly fell into a relentless rhythm: childbirth, brief recovery, and then another pregnancy. Friends and neighbors began to whisper about her ability to keep giving birth so frequently, and some even wondered if there was something extraordinary about her constitution. She was rarely seen in public without the visible signs of motherhood, either a rounded belly or a newborn in her arms. Her life was largely confined to the domestic sphere, but inside those walls, her story was becoming a legend in its own right. The Russian winters came and went, years blurred together, and still, the sound of crying infants filled her home. Anna's early years as a bride were not filled with romance or leisure, but with the constant demands of pregnancy and infant care. At times, she might have longed for a slower pace, for days when she could focus on herself rather than the next child. But in her society, the ability to produce many children was considered not only virtuous but admirable. Neighbors praised her strength, her endurance, and even her patience, though few understood the toll such a life took on her health. In an age before modern medicine, each childbirth carried real danger. Yet Anna somehow survived them all, over and over again. Her story began to spread beyond her village, whispered about at market stalls and over tea in aristocratic drawing rooms. The number of her children grew so quickly that even she struggled to keep track. By the time she was in her 30s, she had already given birth more times than most women would in 2 lifetimes. Behind closed doors, the emotional weight of her situation was immense. While she was celebrated for her fertility, Anna also faced moments of exhaustion that she dared not show to the outside world. Each pregnancy meant months of physical strain, and each birth meant the sleepless nights of caring for an infant while still tending to a household. Her identity became so intertwined with motherhood that she may have forgotten what it meant to be Anna, the young woman she once was before marriage. Visitors to her home often marveled at the sight of children filling every corner, but they did not see the quiet sacrifices, the dreams postponed, the ambitions never pursued, the personal desires pushed aside for the sake of duty. Her story was already remarkable, but it was far from over. Even those who knew her well could not predict the record she was about to set. By the end of her first decade of marriage, Anna had already outpaced nearly every other mother in her region. Her reputation as an almost mythical figure of fertility had grown so large that people from neighboring towns would come just to meet her. They wanted to see the woman who seemed born for motherhood, the woman whose home was a living cradle of life. Yet beneath the admiration and curiosity, Anna's reality was far more complex. She was a symbol of resilience in a time when survival was not guaranteed, but she was also a living example of how societal expectations could consume a person's entire existence. What began as the ordinary life of a young bride had transformed into a relentless cycle of childbearing that would soon break all known records. The woman who had once dreamed of a modest family would, within a few more decades, be remembered as the mother of 44 children, a title she never sought, but one that history would never forget. The years after Anna's first few children passed in a blur of swaddling cloths, lullabies, and the steady rhythm of tiny feet learning to walk. But unlike most mothers, whose childbearing years come in brief intervals with gaps of rest in between, Anna's life knew no such pauses. Her body became a constant vessel of life, carrying one child after another with almost no interruption. Some women spoke of the season when they were expecting, but for Anna, every season felt the same, the soft weight in her belly growing as the snow melted, the same weight still present when leaves fell from the trees. From her late teens into her mid-40s, her existence was a seamless thread of pregnancies, births, and the nurturing of newborns. It is said that for 27 years straight, she was either pregnant or had just given birth, with scarcely a month to call her own. This was not simply motherhood, it was a living cycle that seemed almost impossible, a physical and emotional commitment that few could imagine enduring. The strain on her body was enormous. In an era without the benefit of modern medicine, each delivery was a gamble with fate. Midwives knew her well, arriving with practiced urgency, their hands prepared for the familiar work. And yet, despite the risks, Anna emerged each time with a will as unyielding as the Russian winters outside her door. Her endurance baffled doctors and midwives alike. Some speculated that she possessed an unusually robust constitution, while others whispered that divine providence must have been watching over her. But Anna knew it was not miracles that sustained her, it was sheer necessity. She had children to feed, a household to manage, and the knowledge that in her time and place, refusing the duty of motherhood was almost unthinkable. Her pregnancies were rarely accompanied by rest. The cries of older infants filled her ears while she carried the next, and household chores still demanded attention. As the years rolled on, the sheer number of her children began to astound her community. By the time she had birthed her 20th child, the news had reached far beyond her village. Strangers came to witness her growing family, sometimes bringing gifts, other times simply staring in awe. They would see her with a newborn in her arms, 2 toddlers tugging at her skirts, and several older children running about, and still, they knew that another was already on the way. Her husband, proud yet perhaps oblivious to the toll on his wife, saw each birth as an accomplishment, a step toward cementing his legacy. He would speak of the strength of his family, the abundance of his children, as if they were a sign of divine favor. Anna, however, measured her life not in legacies but in moments, the warmth of a baby sleeping against her chest, the sigh of relief after a safe delivery, the rare moments of quiet when the house was finally still. But the constant childbearing came at a cost. Her body, though resilient, began to carry the marks of unending pregnancies, a weariness in her bones, the deep lines etched into her face, and the silent aches that grew harder to ignore. She knew the faces of grief as well as joy. In a time when disease claimed young lives with little warning, some of her children did not live to see adulthood. These losses, though softened by the presence of so many other children, still cut deeply. Yet, with each passing year, another pregnancy would follow, another tiny life to nurse, another name to remember. She rarely had time to mourn, because the demands of the living left no space for dwelling on the departed. Her story was no fairy tale. It was a testament to the resilience and sacrifices of women whose names rarely make it into the grand chapters of history books. By the 27th year, her tally of births had reached an almost unbelievable number, 44 children in total. Some historians argue about the exact count, but for Anna's community, the number itself had become symbolic, a marker of superhuman endurance. There were whispers that no other woman in Russia had ever come close to such a record. She had lived through more than a quarter of a century of continuous motherhood, and yet she remained, tending to her children, guiding the older ones, nursing the younger ones, and preparing herself for the challenges that still lay ahead. To the outside world, she was a marvel, a living legend of fertility. To herself, she was simply a mother doing what was expected of her, carrying out a role that had consumed almost her entire adult life. She had no idea that centuries later, her story would be told in astonishment, her name remembered not for power or politics, but for the sheer, almost impossible feat of giving life 44 times. When the final child was born, Anna was no longer the young bride who had first stepped into marriage with quiet acceptance. She was now a woman who had lived through nearly 3 decades of unbroken motherhood, whose hands had cradled newborns 44 times. Her hair, once a deep shade of youth, was streaked with silver, her posture slightly bent from years of carrying life. Yet there was still a warmth in her eyes, the kind that comes from having seen every stage of a human life repeated over and over again. Her home, though humble, was alive with movement. Older children bustled about, tending to younger siblings, carrying water, mending clothes, preparing food. Each one carried a part of her within them, not just her features, but pieces of her patience, her endurance, and her quiet strength. The sound of voices was never-ending, sometimes loud with play and laughter, sometimes heavy with quarrels, but always filled with life. To step into Anna's home was to step into a living legacy, a place where history was not written in books but in the faces and names of her children. As her children grew older and began to marry, the reach of her legacy spread far beyond the walls of her house. Weddings brought new faces into the family, and soon grandchildren joined the ever-expanding tree of life she had planted. In her later years, it was said that Anna could not walk through her own village without meeting someone directly descended from her, a nephew, a cousin, a grandchild, or great-grandchild. This living network of people meant her name would not vanish when she passed. It would be spoken at family gatherings for generations. Some saw her as a figure of awe, the woman who had given life to almost half a century's worth of children. Others saw her as a symbol of the endurance demanded of women in her time, endurance not for glory or power, but for survival, family, and tradition. She was living proof of the unspoken truth that history is often carried not by kings and generals, but by women who bear the weight of generations in their bodies and hearts. In private moments, Anna must have reflected on the cost of such a legacy. For every joyful birth, there had been nights of illness, moments of grief, and the quiet fears that come when a child's life hangs in the balance. She had given herself entirely to the role of mother, often at the expense of her own health, her own rest, her own dreams. There were no medals for her labor, no titles for her achievements, only the constant hum of life around her and the satisfaction of seeing her children grow. And yet, perhaps this was enough. In a world that often measured value by wealth or political influence, Anna's value was measured in something far more lasting, the lives she had brought into the world. 44 children meant 44 chances for her family's story to continue, 44 new beginnings that would ripple outward for centuries. Even if the world beyond her village never learned her name, her presence would be felt in the bloodlines she had shaped. As time passed, her story began to fade into local legend. Neighbors told the tale to newcomers, adding details and embellishments with each retelling. Some claimed she had given birth to more than 44, others said fewer, but the truth hardly mattered. The number itself had become part of the myth. What mattered was the image of a woman who had lived almost her entire adult life in service to the next generation. For the children who remembered her, she was a figure of constant presence, the one who had been there at every milestone, the one who had guided them through sickness, through hunger, through the harsh Russian winters. To them, she was not just a mother but the unshakable center of their world. Even in her final years, when her body had grown frail, she could still be found surrounded by children, telling them stories in a voice softened by age but still steady with love. When Anna finally passed away, her funeral was said to be unlike any the village had seen. The crowd that gathered was enormous, not only her children and grandchildren, but neighbors, friends, and distant relatives who had been touched by her life. Some mourned the loss of a woman who had embodied the strength of their community. Others celebrated the life she had lived, knowing her legacy was too vast to ever truly die. The 44 lives she had brought into the world had multiplied into hundreds, perhaps even thousands, by the time the century turned. And somewhere, deep in the threads of family trees across Russia and beyond, Anna's blood still flows. Her story remains a quiet reminder that history is not always written in grand palaces or on the pages of royal decrees. Sometimes, it is written in the everyday endurance of a single human being whose life's work is measured in the lives of others.